Well, thank you very much. I've been asked to explore some of the challenges that are facing Pentecostals today. And I perceive that there are at least two, but you may be aware of others. The two that I would identify are, one, the Bible is less present in the lives of Pentecostals and in the life of the Pentecostal church than it was 30, 40 years ago. The other challenge that Pentecostals face relates to the limited recognition of the place of the Spirit in the lives of Pentecostal Christians, and it's that I'm going to focus on. But let me set a context by talking about Pentecostals, and my first question is, what is a Pentecostal? 100 years ago, just over, Pentecostalism was initiated, and since then it's become the biggest and the fastest growing component of Christianity. It's big, but it's not what it was. Now it's multi-denominational. In fact, there are so many Pentecostal and neo-Pentecostal and renewal churches and independent Pentecostal churches that it is impossible to keep track of them all. There are two Pentecostal dictionaries, one of which has been revised, which seeks to track the landscape of Pentecostalism. Books, journal articles are written to try and explore the move of Pentecostalism, to try and to do justice to establishing the spread of Pentecostalism, because it is so multi-denominational, but it's also multicultural. Initially, it started as a largely Western phenomenon, but now it's increasingly represented by people from the majority world. In fact, currently, about 66% of Pentecostals live in the majority world, so the Southern Hemisphere and the Eastern Hemisphere. About 87% of Pentecostals live in poorer areas of the world, and 71% of Pentecostals are not white. Very different to a generation ago. And then it's also multidimensional. Increasingly, it's more accurate to refer to Pentecostalism in the plural as Pentecostalisms, as there's no longer a set framework in which we can fit us all into as Pentecostals. And the very diversity of Pentecostalism means that it is less identifiable than it once was. Some years ago, I decided to write a book, and I wanted it to be called Pentecostal Distinctives. But the more I thought and the more I wrote, the more I realized we weren't as Pentecostally distinctive as we used to be. So the book actually became Pentecostal Perspectives. Some of the most distinctive elements of being a Pentecostal, the secondary experience of the baptism in the Spirit and speaking in tongues, well, they now are less distinctive within Pentecostalism as they were just a generation or so ago. Well, some of those foundational elements that were central to Pentecostalism and nowhere else in the evangelical church, they are everywhere else in the evangelical church. So now in my travels, I go to Pentecostal churches, charismatic churches, evangelical churches, sacramental churches. It's very difficult to tell the difference between the way we worship, what we believe, what we do in terms of our relationship with God. There's a man called Amos Yong. He's an Asian Pentecostal, and he functions in Regents University in Virginia Beach in the States. And this is what he says about this diversity of Pentecostalism. He says, now it's difficult, if not well nigh impossible, to essentialize Pentecostalism conceptually. In other words, we're big, we're varied, and we're not what we used to be. And that's resulting in umbrella organizations like the World Pentecostal Conference It doesn't include all Pentecostal denominations within it because there's too many of them. It can't accommodate them. And when you then think about how Pentecostalism is manifested in different countries and in different cultures and in different people groups and by different individuals, then the spread increases even more. So defining what a Pentecostal is today is very difficult, and it will depend on the country I'm in, the person I'm talking to, the tradition of that Christian. We're broad. Walter Hollenweger, he's a Swiss Pentecostal. He's now with the Lord, but he was one of the first scholars who began to academically explore what it means to be a Pentecostal. He wrote a 10-volumed book on it in German, which has been reduced into a 1-volumed English version. And he functioned in the University of Birmingham in the UK. He says this: "I don't know anybody who could convincingly define what a mainstream Pentecostal is." And he said that's compounded by the fact that most Pentecostal denominations believe that they are mainstream. We're different, diversely different. So what is our DNA, if there's anything? Well, when I was growing up as a young Pentecostal, it was very easy to tell who I was because I was just so different from all other Christians that I knew. My beliefs, my traditions, the things we did in church, our anticipation of what God would do in our meetings was different to other evangelical denominations. And when I went to Theological College in London as a Pentecostal, I was a very small minority in that group of Christians. And theology was what distinguished us. So fundamentally, although Pentecostals have a wide range of agreement with other evangelical Christians, we fundamentally see ourselves as being fourfold. So we often will describe ourselves as believing that Jesus is our Savior, our healer, our baptizer, our coming King. That's what makes a Pentecostal 40 years ago. But then holiness Pentecostals, and they make a significant proportion of Pentecostals, they added another issue, which was the sanctifying role of Jesus. They anticipated that when somebody was baptized in the Spirit with a secondary experience, that would somehow have a sanctifying impact on their lives. Whoa, that was a new one to most Pentecostals. That means there's 5 distinctives. And now there's another one that's been added, mainly as a result of David Yonggi Cho. So this is a Korean and Asian distinctive, and that talks about the concept of blessing. Now we're up to 6. And when you think about other aspects of our theological perspectives, it's difficult to tie us down, especially because, as I've said, other Christians espouse those same perspectives that once only belonged to Pentecostals. So theology is not the way whereby we can define ourselves, which leads me to suggest something else, and it's encounter. I wrote a book called Pentecostal Theology, and my strapline is a theology of encounter. Why did I come to that conclusion? I only came to it as a result of exploring what it was to be a Pentecostal. And what I discovered that at heart, conceptually, that which was fundamental to Pentecostals was a desire to encounter each other as we met together. We go to meetings with each other. We want to interact with each other. We want to dialogue with each other. We enjoy fellowship. We also want to interact with God. We desire that we will encounter him and experience him. And that experience might be emotionally based or increasingly intellectually based. We want to touch him and we want him to touch us. We want him to transform us. Encounter is central to who we are. When it comes to reading the Bible, we're not generally content to just read it. We want to meet God in it. We look for a word from the Lord. We anticipate the possibility that God might speak to us personally through the Bible, which of course wasn't written to us initially, but to generations of people thousands of years ago. But still, we say, no, God will use that to speak to us. So although we're not distinctive in anticipating this encountering element, I think we could say that this is an element that is particularly significant to us as Pentecostals. We, in our spirituality, expect to experience God, and that in particular relates to the Spirit. Of course we anticipate that Jesus will speak to us, the Father will speak to us. Of course we anticipate that they will be involved in transforming us. But we do look forward to those occasions when the Spirit will do something in our lives as well. There's a man called Larry Christianson. He's a Lutheran, an American, and charismatic. This is how he described Pentecostalism. Quite interesting. He says, Pentecostals, they're Christians who stand on tiptoe expecting something to happen. That was his definition as he perceived Pentecostals. They're Christians who are on tiptoe looking out for the next thing that the Spirit is going to do. I quite like that. And back to that same man, Walter Hollenweger, that Swiss who was writing on Pentecostalism. He wasn't a Pentecostal himself. He was a sacramental-based, traditional Christian, and he expressed Pentecostal as being best manifesting itself as an opportunity for believers to engage, here you go, in an adventure of fellowship with the Spirit and with each other. So people who perceive us, and as I perceive us, as I've explored Pentecostalism and my own journey with God, I sense that this possibility of discovery is important to us. We have a quest for a destiny. We're interested in exploring the inexplicable. We want to touch God. We want God to touch us. We want to see God, metaphorically, and we anticipate that he does see us, but not from a distance, but from a very close proximity to ourselves. We anticipate that he will transform us. That, I think, might be our DNA, and if it is, it's a good DNA. But that brings me to our challenge as Pentecostals, because I think we're losing that expectation of the Spirit touching us. I don't know whether you've ever been in a situation where you can't remember somebody's name. I've experienced that this week. I know their face, but I just can't remember their name. I generally like it when my wife Judy is with me, because we have a little trick, and that is if I see somebody coming who I know, but I can't remember their name, and yet they're going to anticipate that I should know their name, I'll just squeeze her hand just a little bit. And that means that she knows what I'm thinking, and so she will say, hello, my name is Judy, what's your name? And she's rescued me. But I don't know whether you've ever been in a situation where you know somebody's name, but you don't know their face. This often has occurred to me in an airport where I'm being picked up by somebody. They know my name, but I don't know whether they know what I look like. I was at a conference once in Boston, in Massachusetts, and was a little late for the conference where I was the speaker. And the taxi just took time to get through the traffic. And when I arrived in the room, which was packed with people waiting, and where the chairman was desperate to see Keith Warrington coming, when he did see Keith Warrington coming, it didn't bring any sense of calm to his mind because he didn't know what I looked like. He only knew my name. Well, I have been in a time in my life where there was a danger that I was going to get to heaven and I was going to have to be introduced to the Spirit as someone whose name I knew, but his face I didn't. I knew his name, but I didn't know him. I didn't know his character. I didn't know his personality. And yet I was a Pentecostal, and I'd been taught about the Spirit, but my traditioning had been so narrow. I'd learned Acts 1:8. As soon as I'd learned John 3:16, I learned the next most important verse for Pentecostals, Acts 1:8. But I was in danger of having a very truncated perspective of who the Spirit was, and that was going to be to my cost. That's our challenge, or at least one of them. Pentecostalism, the fastest growing stream of Christianity that has had the privilege of introducing the Spirit to the Christian world in a way that he has not been presented in the previous 1900 years of Christendom by and large. but we're in danger as Pentecostals of marginalizing him in our praxis, in our belief, because we often misunderstand what his relationship is with us. We think that he's involved in our lives mainly to give us gifts. He's the gift giver. And in my experience, and in the experience of many Pentecostals, he's not a very generous gift giver, because he doesn't seem to give many gifts out, and when he does give them, he gives them to a select few, and the majority don't seem to get a gift. So even when he has a responsibility, he seems to be a bit arbitrary in the way that he manifests his presence. And the other main reason why Pentecostals think that the Spirit is involved in their lives is that he's the one who is delegated by the Godhead to catch us in our sin and put us right and chastise us and tell us off and discipline us. And don't get me wrong, that is a part of his responsibility, and we have information to that fact in the New Testament. But that's not his top agenda. But that's how often he's presented to us. Jesus is our friend. God is our Father. Spirit is our headmaster, and we misunderstand just what a wonderful, wonderful member of the Godhead that he is. The consequence of this limited perspective in our traditioning is that rarely do Pentecostals assume that the Spirit will speak to them. Why should he? If he's going to speak, he's going to speak through the preacher on the Sunday. Why is he going to speak to them when he can speak to us through somebody else who's more worthy of his presence? Why is he going to speak to somebody else through us? We're not that significant. And because we think that, we don't listen. Because we're not anticipating that he's going to be speaking to us, because we have not been taught that that is a major element of his agenda. Well, the truth is, the Spirit is more important, he's more central to our lives, he's more imminently involved in our lives as believers, more often, more regularly than we can imagine or dream. But because we don't know it, because we've not been taught it, we don't know what we're missing. We assume that Jesus walks with us, the Father loves us, but the Spirit, well, he's the silent member of the Trinity. He lives on the other side of the universe. Once in a while, he'll turn up and do something good, but it won't be for many people, and then he's gone. He'll come back maybe in a few years and give us something spiritual, something special, something that'll make us tingle emotionally, physically, intellectually, but he's gone again. We don't know what we're missing. So how can we change the landscape? How can we as leaders and potential leaders help our Pentecostal friends and colleagues, members of our Pentecostal family, have a better perspective of who the Spirit is, a more New Testament-based perspective that will do them good? Well, let me ask this question, but you don't have to answer it out loud. How do Pentecostals expect to experience the Spirit? Traditionally, how have we been taught is the way that the Spirit will encounter us? Other than those once in a blue moon moments when he comes into our lives and does something good, most Pentecostals will think the Spirit gets involved in our lives when, number one, we receive the baptism in the Spirit, which is what we as Pentecostals refer to as an experience that postdates salvation. It's a secondary experience. That's when the Spirit substantially gets involved in our lives, we say. And secondly, we might say that the Spirit demonstrates his presence in our lives specifically when we speak in tongues. Now, I could question both of those facts, but if that's what Pentecostals think, we've got a problem. Not just because it is far too limited a perspective of what the Spirit does in our lives, but it is a problem because the baptism in the Spirit and speaking in tongues are on the decrease in the white west of Pentecostalism. Let me give you some facts. The Assemblies of God Church in the US is the biggest Pentecostal denomination, and the number of converts in that Pentecostal denomination has increased over the years. But the numbers of people who have been baptized in the Spirit, in the Pentecostal understanding of that term as a secondary experience, that number has plateaued for the past 25 years. And for every converts to Christianity who become members of the Assemblies of God denomination, for every 5, 1 receives the baptism in the Spirit. In other words, the baptism in the Spirit, at least in that denomination, is on the decrease. And if I look at the UK Pentecostal landscape in my own denomination, it's exactly the same. And many Pentecostal leaders are losing confidence in the baptism in the Spirit. What is it that we're anticipating that people should receive when they have this experience? How can we guide them to receive this experience? We don't know what is the manifestation. Now, we used to associate it with speaking in tongues, but many Pentecostals are recognizing that the book of Acts does not always associate speaking in tongues with what we think is the baptism in the Spirit. And anyway, speaking in tongues is on the decrease, certainly in the Pentecostal world in the White West, and it's diminishing in other parts of the world as well. Speaking in tongues is at an all-time low amongst Pentecostals. The Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life is a first-class, hugely significant research organization, and it undertook a 10-country survey concerning Pentecostal belief, Pentecostal practice. And they chose 10 countries where Pentecostals were bigger numbers of Christians in the Christian community in their churches. Here are the 10 countries: the USA, Brazil, Chile, Guatemala, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, India, the Philippines, South Korea. And they asked all kinds of questions to Pentecostal living in those settings. The one I'm particularly interested in relates to speaking in tongues. And the question addressed to these Pentecostals who are living in these 10 countries, major components of Christianity: how many of you speak in tongues? In 6 of the countries, more than 40% of Pentecostals said they never speak in tongues. In the US, it's over 50% of Pentecostals never speak in tongues. Now, we could address that and ask questions as to why that might be, but my perspective is to say this: if Pentecostals think that they will encounter the Spirit in the baptism of the Spirit and in speaking in tongues, and both of these are on the demise, does that mean that the Spirit has very little to offer to Pentecostals, let alone other Christians? Maybe he's less important than we even thought. Maybe he lives further on the other side of the universe for longer periods of time than we might imagine. There's a lady called Margaret Paloma. She's a sociologist. She's not a Pentecostal, but she's a friend of Pentecostal. She's an American. Listen to what she says. In some classical Pentecostal circles, glossolalia, speaking in tongues, is in danger of becoming a doctrine devoid of practice, with an estimated 50% or more Pentecostals not speaking in tongues. Do you hear what I'm saying? If Pentecostals think the Spirit's going to encounter us in the baptism and in speaking in tongues, and once in a while some other lovely experience, but don't expect too many of them, and those two are on the demise, does that mean that the Spirit is less interested in us than we might have imagined? Oh, dearie me, we have got it so wrong. We just don't know what we're missing. We don't realize that the Spirit is a comprehensive resource for believers. We don't realize that the Spirit is committed not just to helping us change ourselves, but he is committed to proactively transform us himself. We just don't know that. We don't know that the Spirit is providing comprehensive, limitless resources for us to develop our relationship with God. Have we been taught that by our Pentecostal leaders? Too little have we been taught it. And because we haven't been taught it, we don't anticipate the reality of it. And so we confusingly meander our way into our relationship with God. Well, all the time, the Spirit is on the side saying, please let me help you, because Paul said he would. And we're not listening. So here's our challenge. Our Pentecostal DNA suggests that at heart, we are a people who want to encounter God in the Bible, within each other, in our communities. We want to experience God. We want the Spirit to touch us. We want the Spirit to transform us. We anticipate that that will happen. But our praxis, our day-to-day lives suggest that that doesn't happen. And our conclusion is we think we've built the Spirit up too much. We've bigged him up too much in our estimation of his involvement in our lives. He has less to do with us than we might imagine. And he's a little bit like a Cinderella who comes to the ball late and leaves something small, precious but small, and then he's gone off into the night, and we may never see him again. To anticipate that he might actually be interested in making a powerful difference in our lives is something that most Pentecostals don't anticipate will happen. And if it is going to happen, it's going to happen because they're in a context where there's a special speaker who's going to announce some time of anointing, and they will be open to that possibility, when all the time, in the quiet of individual journeys with God, the Spirit is anxious to impact us. We just think he's too busy, and we look elsewhere for guidance, and all the time the devil smirks. Because in truth, the Spirit has never stopped directing us to the destiny that he's set for us. So let me move to a conclusion. What can we do to help change the landscape? First thing I want to suggest is that we remember that the Spirit is not just a force, he's a friend. Of course he has power. Of course he's a powerful wind, but he's also a personality. He has characteristics. He has friendship that he wants to engage with us in. He's a powerful energy, but he is also a powerful mentor. He's the best friend that Jesus could give to us. He's not a liquid. We don't breathe him in. He's not just a force. He's our friend. We need to reorientate our thinking to recognize the reality of that. Oh, it's true, he doesn't have a body. He doesn't have ears to hear. He doesn't have eyes to see. He can't cry, but he feels for us with an intimacy that only he can experience. How many of us realize that, let alone experience it, let alone live in the truth of that beautiful fact? Secondly, as Pentecostals, we need to remember that the Spirit is more than interested in the baptism in the Spirit. Sometimes as Pentecostals, we have so elevated the baptism in the Spirit, we have so identified it as this is when the Spirit will get involved in your life, that we forget that the Spirit was actually centrally in our lives from the moment we became a Christian. In fact, before we became a Christian, who was identifying within us that we were sinners? It was the Spirit. And from the moment we became a Christian, he began to walk with us right through to the end of our lives. He's our heavenly bodyguard. He's our travel guide who walks with us intimately, personally, individually. And along the way, there will be occasions where he will give us a special sense of himself, an infusion of his presence. We may well call it the baptism of the Spirit. The manifestation, the consequence of that experience may be varied. It may be speaking in tongues. It may be that we prophesy for the first time. It may be that we have a greater love for the Bible. It may be that we have a greater love for God. It may be that we have a greater power to evangelize. I'm not going to restrict the Spirit to manifest his presence in the way that he wants to at any given moment. But please, let's not think he only comes once. The trouble with the baptism in the Spirit is so elevated that we think, well, now I've been baptized in the Spirit, now I speak in tongues, now I can die happy. There's nothing else left. And the Spirit is saying, oh, for goodness sake, I have so much to give to you. And sometimes it will be cataclysmic, sometimes it will be big, but sometimes it will be tiny. But I'm always going to be influencing you. What I want you to be doing is to be anticipating that that might happen more than you realize. One of the other, just as a segue, one of the other challenges that we have when we big up the baptism in the Spirit, and I'm not wanting to denigrate it at all, but when we elevate it too much, we can be in danger of sidelining Christians, Pentecostal Christians, who have not had that experience. And they can think, well, I'm second class, especially if we think that that experience is the gateway to other gifts. That's a Pentecostal expression. It's not a New Testament expression, but sometimes we assume that that's the reality. Once you're baptized in the Spirit, then you'll have the gifts of the Spirit. Well, where does it say that in the New Testament? Because the Spirit's ability to give gifts predate such an experience, and they postdate such an experience. And some gifts that the Spirit gives us were actually part of our lives before we became Christians, because he made us who we are, and after we become Christians, he can take advantage of those gifts in a way that he couldn't before we were Christians. But most importantly, we need to help each other and ourselves realize that he is on our side, the Spirit. From the minute we become a Christian, he's not just by our side. I'm not making a statement as to the proximity of the Spirit to us. I'm saying he's on my side. At which point you say, well, hold on. I'm not sure that he is on my side, because today I've not been living a very good life as a Christian, and my level of spirituality is not what it should be. So I'm not sure whether I can claim that he is on my side. I want to tell you that the message of the New Testament is that he is on your side. He's on my side. I'm not being precocious. I'm not assuming that I'm better than I am. I know that he's on my side because he has unilaterally determined to be on my side from the minute I become a Christian. And that message permeates the writings of Paul, but not just Paul. He seals us, Paul says in Ephesians 1. When does he do that? The minute we become a child of God, a son, a daughter of God, the Spirit seals us. And the context of that concept of sealing means you're safe, you're owned, you belong, and from that moment, nobody can remove you from the presence of the one who has sealed you with himself. That's the Spirit. That starts at salvation. And thereafter, the Spirit says, I'm going to walk with you. And in fact, I'm not just going to walk with you, but Romans 8:26, when you don't know what to pray, it's okay, I'm going to pray for you. Now think about that for a minute. Who's the Spirit praying to? Is he praying to God the Father? Well, the Spirit is God. Can the Spirit pray as God? And if he is talking to Jesus and the Father, is he telling the Father and Jesus something that they don't know? Is he encouraging them to look after me? Certainly not. Is he guiding them as to how they should do it? Certainly not. But the presentation that Paul is offering in this beautiful picture when he says the Spirit prays for us with words that can't be uttered, the picture is that the Spirit is so close to us, that it's as if he's closer to us than he is to the Father and to Jesus. It's a metaphor. The Spirit cannot be separated from the Father. He cannot be separated from Jesus. But the writer Paul says the metaphor, the picture that I want you to work with is that he's closer to you than you can imagine. And he's so close that it's as if he's closer to you than he is to the other members of the Godhead. That's how proximate he is to you. So let me come to a conclusion. Here's our challenge. We believe that we can encounter God. We believe that God can encounter us. We believe that we can experience God. We believe that God can transform us. We believe that the Spirit is a central element in our lives, but we have a truncated perspective of his involvement in our lives. We think his agenda is to be somewhat utilitarian, giving us a job to do, a gift, so that we can benefit somebody else. And the other thing he does for us is tell us off. And once in a little while, he might do something nice for us. But don't expect it. That's not going to happen too often. And we miss the main agenda of the Spirit to us, which is to do us good. To do us good? Wow. Really? Yes. Sit back. Put your feet up. Get a cup of coffee. Enjoy the reality of this truth. He's on your side to do you good. We have a heartbeat, a central core to desire to encounter the Spirit. Our challenge, listen to him. Listen to what the writers of the New Testament say about him. He's an endless source of exploration, and we'll never finally close the book on that process of exploring who he is. But as children who are presented with a delightful treasure He draws us to himself and says, come and enjoy me. Come and enjoy me. That's what you'll be doing for eternity, but you can start now. Now we can run towards him, we can tentatively tiptoe in his direction, or looking over our shoulders, wondering whether the space is too sacred on which we're standing, wondering whether we should be this close to him. It doesn't really matter. However we approach him, the one thing we can be certain of is that we're coming home to the one who has us in his heart.